55 seconds for you and for me. 55 seconds mean practically nothing. They pass in the blink of an eye. But for Niki Lauda, it seemed like an eternity, because for almost a minute, the world champion remained trapped inside a burning Ferrari. While the fire consumed his car, the toxic smoke filled his lungs, and several drivers desperately tried to free him before it was too late. It was during those 55 seconds that Niki Lauda came face to face with death. And when they finally managed to get him out, his injuries were so severe that few believed he would survive. Even a priest came to give him the last rites. However, Lauda not only survived, because just 42 days later, he achieved a feat that made Formula One history. The most incredible thing is that he himself had warned that the race was too dangerous. He tried to stop it, but no one listened to him, and hours later, he ended up experiencing exactly the tragedy he had tried to prevent. But that accident not only left Niki Lauda on the brink of death, it also changed his life forever. Niki Lauda was not a driver who relied on luck. He was cold, calculating, and brutally direct. His way of racing was not based solely on courage. Lauda studied every detail of the car, analyzed every risk, and prepared for any problem before it happened. He had a personality that not only made him one of the fastest drivers on the grid, but also one of the most difficult to deal with, especially within Ferrari. Because Lauda never hesitated to tell him. Not even when the person in front of him was Enzo Ferrari. However, behind that coldness, there was absolute confidence in his own abilities. Lauda was convinced that he could overcome any problem, drive any car, and win any championship. And up to that moment, everything seemed to prove him right. In 1975, he had achieved his first world title, bringing Ferrari back to the top after more than a decade without winning the Drivers' Championship. And at the start of the following season, Lauda was not only the champion, he also seemed unbeatable. Because while other drivers relied on their instinct or bravery to find the limit, Lauda found it through precision, preparation, and control. However, in 1976, he would face a situation for which no preparation was enough. A situation in which, for the first time, control slipped out of his hands. Niki Lauda arrived at the 1976 German Grand Prix as the reigning champion, the undisputed leader of the championship, and a driver who, up to that point, seemed impossible to beat, had won 5 of the first 9 races. However, behind him, a completely different rival was beginning to emerge. James Hunt was one of the most popular drivers on the grid. He was charismatic, impulsive, a party-goer, and was willing to risk everything just to win. While Lauda led a life marked by discipline and control, Hunt seemed to enjoy chaos both on and off the track. That's why, even though both were extremely fast, they represented 2 completely opposite ways of understanding Formula One. Hunt relied on his instincts. Lauda relied on his preparation. Hunt was the favorite of the media and the fans. Meanwhile, Lauda, with his cold personality and thin face, had even earned the derogatory nickname, the Rat. But although he couldn't compete with Hunt's charisma on the track, few could come close to his speed. And after dominating most of the season, everything indicated that Lauda would achieve his 2nd consecutive championship. However, the 10th race of the year was held on a circuit where speed wasn't the only thing that mattered. Because Niki Lauda already knew how dangerous the Nürburgring could be, and that a single mistake could cost him his life. Niki Lauda's concern was not exaggerated. Nürburgring was one of the most dangerous circuits in the world. So dangerous that it had already claimed 5 lives. Its old version, known as the Green Hell, was almost 23 kilometers long. It ran through the forests and mountains of Eifel, and it was so extensive that the conditions could change completely from one area to another. One part of the circuit could be dry, while several kilometers ahead it could be raining heavily. But that wasn't the only problem. Its enormous length made it practically impossible to cover the entire track with enough marshals, doctors, and emergency teams. In case of an accident, help could take several minutes to arrive. Minutes that could mean the difference between life and death. That's why, before the race, Lauda asked for the Grand Prix not to be held. He believed that the safety measures were insufficient, and that racing under those conditions was a risk none of them should accept. However, not everyone thought the same. The proposal was put to a vote, and by just one vote, the drivers decided to race. Lauda had lost. So despite knowing the risks better than anyone, he would also have to take part in the race, without imagining that just a few hours later, he would need the very safety measures he had insisted on so strongly. But before that, if you're enjoying the video, subscribe. The weather became unpredictable at the start of the race. A light rain had wet some parts of the circuit before the start. That's why Lauda decided to start with rain tires. However, the track dried much faster than expected, and as soon as the race started, it became clear that he had made the wrong decision. At the end of the first lap, he went into the pits to switch to slick tires. The pit stop made him lose several positions. So when he got back on the track, he started to push to regain the ground he had lost. The problem was that his new tires were still cold, and on a circuit as fast and dangerous as Nürburgring, that meant the car had much less grip. Despite that, Lauda kept pushing until, during the second lap, he reached one of the fastest sections of the circuit. And in a matter of seconds, everything went terribly wrong. As he approached the fast corner before Bergwerk, Lauda lost control of his Ferrari. The car shot off to the side of the track and crashed violently into the barriers. The impact was so strong that it made the car bounce back onto the track. Also, since the race had just started, it was still carrying a large amount of fuel. So, within seconds, the car was engulfed in flames, with Lauda trapped inside. However, the worst was yet to come. Guy Edwards, who was right behind him, managed to barely avoid him. But Brett Langer didn't have time to react and ended up crashing into him head-on. Seconds later, Harold Earl also crashed into Langer's car. The collision caused the Ferrari to spin again on the track. Meanwhile, Lauda remained trapped in the flames, surrounded by smoke and breathing the toxic fumes that filled the inside of the car. In addition, the emergency teams were still too far away, exactly as Lauda had warned before the race. So his only chance of survival depended on the drivers who had just stopped around him. Guy Edwards was the first to get out of his car, and without waiting for the emergency teams to arrive, he ran straight toward the flames. Shortly after, Brett Langer and Harold Earl joined the rescue. Earl got a fire extinguisher and started fighting the fire, while Edwards and Langer tried to get Lauda out of the car. But there was a problem. Lauda was still held by the safety harness, and the heat was so intense that they could only get close for a few seconds before having to back away. Lauda was still conscious, trying to escape the flames and desperately struggling against the belts that kept him trapped. But the more time passed, the more toxic smoke entered his lungs, and his chances of survival decreased with every second. Then Arturo Merzario appeared, another driver who had stopped to help and who had also raced for Ferrari a few years earlier. That's why he knew how the seatbelt mechanism worked. So he went into the flames, put half his body inside the car, and finally managed to release the harness. By that time, Lauda had already lost consciousness, and because his body stopped resisting, Langer and the others were able to pull him out of the Ferrari. Years later, Marcello recalled, "It wasn't easy. Niki was suffering a lot and was struggling with all his strength against the seatbelts, trying to get away from the flames. Thank God, he finally lost consciousness. Only when his body stopped resisting was I able to free him. Once he was free, the weight of his body caused Langer to lose his balance and fall, taking Lauda with him. Only 55 seconds had passed since the accident, but for Lauda, it felt like an eternity. because he spent 55 seconds trapped in the flames, breathing toxic smoke, and waiting for professional help that didn't arrive in time. However, thanks to 4 drivers who decided to risk their own lives to save him, especially Marsalio, Niki Lauda managed to get out of the fire. In fact, years later, he remembered him with gratitude. There was a guy named Arturo Merzario who went into the flames and pulled me out of the wreckage of the car all by himself. That's how I survived. He really saved my life, because a few more seconds and I wouldn't have made it. And even though Lauda managed to survive the accident, the real hell was about to begin. Getting Lauda out of the fire didn't mean he was safe. His injuries were devastating. He had suffered first, second, and third-degree burns on his head and hands, and had lost much of his right ear and his eyelashes. In addition, his eyelids were severely damaged and he had several broken bones. But the burns were not the greatest danger, since during the 55 seconds he was trapped, Lauda had inhaled a huge amount of toxic smoke. Because of this, his lungs and airways were severely damaged. Lauda was first taken to a nearby hospital and then brought to a specialized burn clinic. However, over the next few days, his condition continued to worsen. He was having more and more trouble breathing, and the oxygen level in his blood dropped to a critical level. The doctors began to believe that he wouldn't survive. So 3 days after the accident, they called a priest to give him the last rites. Lauda was still conscious, and when he realized what was happening, he refused to accept that his life was about to end. According to what he later said, that moment awakened something inside him, because if everyone expected him to die, he was determined to prove them wrong. Shortly after, his condition began to improve, and although his recovery had started, it was not easy at all, as he recalled years later. So he asked a nurse in the burn unit, "When can I look at myself in a mirror?" "Whenever you want," she replied. She should never have allowed me to do it. She turned on a neon light, and because of the heat and fluid retention, my head looked like it had sunk between my shoulders. Shit, I thought. Of course, after that, I kept getting better and better. I had seen my wounds at their worst. However, surviving was only the first step, because while Lauda was just beginning his recovery, Ferrari was already preparing to move on without him. But before we continue, if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe. We already have more than 90,000 subscribers. So we're in the final stretch to reach the much-awaited 100,000 subscribers. So join us and subscribe. Thank you. Ferrari was ready to move on without Lauda, because while he was still struggling to recover, the team hired Carlos Reutemann to take his place for the rest of the season, a decision that Lauda interpreted as a lack of confidence. After all, he was not only still the world champion, but he had also just led Ferrari through one of their most dominant seasons. And while he was still recovering from his injuries, the team had already prepared to replace him. That's why Lauda decided to send them a message. Just a few weeks after the accident, he showed up at the Fiorano circuit to drive again. His appearance shocked everyone who saw him. He had lost most of his hair, his face was still covered in scars, and he still had trouble fully closing his eyes. Daniel Audetto, the team manager, recalled that Lauda looked like a ghost. However, he hadn't come back to prove he was recovered, because clearly he wasn't. He had come back to prove that he was still capable of driving. Lauda was still leading the championship. He had already missed 2 races, and he wasn't willing to miss a third one. He was going to fight. So, just 42 days after being trapped in the flames, he announced that he would return to compete in the Italian Grand Prix. Although first, he would have to find out if he could face his fear again, and if his body was ready to get back into a Formula One car. Lauda's return started off much worse than expected, because when he drove at high speed again, he discovered that the accident had left a wound that wasn't visible. He was afraid. Every turn reminded him of the moment he lost control. And for the first time, the driver who had always trusted in his preparation doubted whether he was really capable of continuing to compete. Lauda later admitted that he was terrified, but little by little, he began to regain his confidence. And when it was time to race, he decided to go ahead. Even though fear wasn't the only problem, his wounds still hadn't healed. He needed to use a modified helmet to reduce the pressure on his burns. And even so, every movement caused unbearable pain. During the race, the wounds on his head reopened, and when he returned to the pits, his bandages were soaked with blood. However, Lauda kept going, lap after lap, enduring the pain, the difficulty closing his eyes, and the fear that it could all happen again. Finally, he crossed the finish line in 4th place. He hadn't won the race, he hadn't even finished on the podium, but just 42 days after receiving the last rites, Niki Lauda had managed to complete a Formula One Grand Prix again. He had proven that the accident didn't end his career, and above all, that he was still capable of competing despite the fear. Lauda could still win the title, but to do so, he had to overcome one last test and decide how far he was willing to risk his life again. The 1976 championship was to be decided in Fuji, and Niki Lauda arrived as the leader. Despite having missed 2 races and still competing far from his best physical condition, he maintained a 3-point lead over James Hunt, so the title was still in his hands. But on the day of the race, torrential rain began to fall. The track was completely flooded, the fog slowed them down, and in some sections, the drivers could barely keep their cars under control. The conditions were so dangerous that the start had to be delayed, and several people began to question whether the race should take place. Lauda was one of the most adamant. After what happened at the Nürburgring, he knew better than anyone what could happen if they agreed to race under unsafe conditions. However, the organizers decided to go ahead, and James Hunt made it clear that if the race started, he was going to compete. Lauda found himself in the same situation once again. He considered that racing was too dangerous, but if he refused, he could lose the championship, for which he had returned just 42 days after being on the brink of death. That's why he took his place on the grid. And when the race started, he tried to stay on track, but after just 2 laps, he made a decision that would forever shape the sport's history. Lauda returned to the pits, stopped the car, and retired from the race. He hadn't had any mechanical problems. He simply considered that continuing to compete under those conditions was too dangerous, a decision that practically left the championship in the hands of James Hunt. Because with Lauda out of the race, the Brit only needed to finish among the top 4 to become champion. But Lauda was not willing to change his mind. He had survived at Nürburgring, had returned when his wounds still hadn't healed, and had endured the pain to stay in the fight for the title. But that didn't mean he was willing to risk his life in just any race. For him, no championship was worth it if, to achieve it, he had to ignore a danger he considered unacceptable. This time, Lauda didn't let the organizers, the other drivers, or even the possibility of being champion decide how much he was willing to risk. Meanwhile, Hunt continued on the track. For much of the race, he seemed to have the championship under control. But when the conditions started to improve, his tires wore out, he had to pit, and he dropped to 5th position. For a few minutes, it seemed that Lauda could become champion without even finishing the race. However, Hunt began to make a comeback, and in the final laps, he managed to recover 3rd position, the result he needed to become world champion by just 1 point. Niki Lauda had lost the title, but not because he lacked the courage to take risks, but because after coming face to face with death, he understood that it also takes courage to decide when to stop. However, the story didn't end there. The following year, he fought for the title again, and this time, no one could stop him. Lauda didn't need to win every race, nor prove that he was the bravest driver on the grid. He simply went back to doing what he did best, being consistent, calculating every risk, and getting the results he needed. In 1977, he became world champion again, just a year after the accident that had nearly cost him his life. On the other hand, his relationship with Ferrari was already completely deteriorated. And after securing the title, he left the team with 2 races remaining in the season. Sometime later, Lauda retired from Formula One. However, his story didn't end there either. In 1982, Lauda returned to compete with McLaren, and 2 years later, he was fighting for the championship again, this time against his own teammate, Alain Prost. Lauda was no longer the fastest driver on the grid, but he was still one of the smartest. And using the same precision that had defined his entire career, he managed to beat Prost by just half a point, the smallest margin in a championship decider. Thus, in 1984, Niki Lauda won his third world title, 8 years after being trapped for 55 seconds inside a burning car. But before we continue, if you want to support the channel so we can make more videos like this, subscribe. Niki Lauda was much more than just the driver who survived Nürburgring. He was a 3-time world champion, one of the smartest drivers in history, and one of the figures who fought the hardest to improve safety in Formula One. But those 55 seconds never left him. The scars remained visible for the rest of his life, just like the damage caused by the toxic smoke he breathed while he was trapped in the flames. In 2018, Lauda had to undergo a lung transplant, and on May 20, 2019, he passed away at the age of 70. By then, more than 4 decades had passed since those 55 seconds at Nürburgring. During that time, he returned to racing, became champion again, and became one of the most important figures in the history of Formula One. However, Lauda was not the only Ferrari legend who suffered an accident of such magnitude, because a few years after what happened at Nürburgring, there was another driver who suffered a catastrophe. So watch this video if you want to learn about the greatest tragedy in Ferrari's history.